All right, everybody, welcome to today's Freedom Hub Working Group. I'm your host, Jeff Cantor, along with my co-host, Charles Froman. Just wanted you to remember you are being sponsored by your Freedom Hub, and we're trying to unite all these activists and disruptors out there, and today's going to be no exception. We are also recording all of these for posterity, so please feel free to visit any of the sites that we display these at. The top link here is for you to register for future ones of these. You'll get automatic reminders. And these other ones are case sensitive, be aware. So if you're watching this, want to freeze frame it, you'll want to make sure you get the case correct. But we're at all the right channels, hopefully for you, and we'll be glad to have you come visit us there. Just to give you a little quick diversion here before we take over for today's topic. As I said, there are visible at all these, and there is a wealth of ones to visit and a lot of interesting topics covered and a lot of disruptors out there, which is very engaging to be sure. And I'm Brightian and some other areas as well. And as I said, it's sponsored by your Freedom Hub. But let's kind of get into where we are today a little bit here. So I'm going to let Charles step in here at this point.
Okay, Jeff, Charlie here, and welcome, Arvin, and a quick intro. I met Arvin Vohra in the D.C. area back during the Governor Gary Johnson presidential campaign, and he was at that time, as I knew him, rising in the ranks of the official party apparatus, and he soon became the vice chair of the party. And most of us in the movement have gotten to know Arvin as an education expert and entrepreneur. He can clarify this, but I think he gets paid by the smarter high school graduates how to get into the Ivy League schools. So he is gifted in gaming the system, to the extent that it is a game and a system of how to get into higher education. And lately, he's been running for president and taking a very unique approach that politics actually is secondary to the whole political process, in that you have to look at the culture first. And I love his line that if we abolish government tomorrow, this culture would rebuild the same government we have because it's the same culture. And that idea of culture before politics, some of us feel, becomes even more relevant now, in that we're in a pretty surreal crisis with this pandemic and the ensuing recession. So many people are giving up their rights out of fear, and maybe necessarily so, but others are thinking there are some terrifying ramifications politically to this crisis. And therefore, do we need to have a discussion about upgrading our cultural ways of thinking and doing, especially in response to these crises, because they're going to happen again. And if it happens again, are we going to lose our Republican, way of life even more, limited government, maximum freedom? So that's my intro. And by the way, because Arvin is an education entrepreneur, as so many of us parents working from home are having to homeschool in a hurry, I hope Arvin talks about his homeschool boot camp and other online tutoring to teach us how to do it right, because he is very skilled in this area. So Jeff, that's our intro.
Oh, very nice. And as you can see, this is going to be an interesting situation tonight. So let's find out what Arvin has to tell us. I'm going to stop sharing my screen and allow you to become the presenter there.
Ah, fantastic. All right. Well, guys, first I want to thank you guys for having me on. And I want to start out jumping off what Charles said, which is that this culture, that our culture today has produced this government. And I want to show exactly what I mean by that. So if you don't mind, I'm going to share my screen. I want to show a couple of things to really establish where today's culture is. The myth out there, the libertarian myth, and I want to set this myth really straight really quickly, is that most people see government as a necessary evil. Yes, everybody, for example, thinks that government schools are a type of welfare, but it's all we can do, so that's what we do. And that is not in any way an accurate reflection of American culture right now. So as we talk about how to change today's culture so that we can change this government, we need to establish what this culture actually is. I'm going to share something with you guys here. And so you'll see over here, this is from lp.org. And this comes from 2019, where the Libertarian National Committee, and by the way, this was after I was on the Libertarian National Committee. I'm in no way responsible for this. The Libertarian Party, the spearhead of the libertarian movement, put out this: the president is throwing the lives of thousands of federal workers into turmoil. And then, it describes why. But notice that the implicit assumption there is that working for the federal government is good. Even with libertarians, we who want to tear down the federal government, we who want to, you have people like Adam Kokesh who want to abolish it completely, people like me who want to get rid of all of it and just hang out there and be a partner in chief. We are the ones who are decrying the fact that the shutdown threw the lives of federal workers temporarily into turmoil. In other words, we still think of the federal government as working for the federal government as basically a good thing to do. In 2016, the Gary Johnson campaign advertised heavily outside of military bases, but they didn't advertise saying something like, you're in the military right now, you want to defend freedom, the way to defend freedom, leave the military, come join us. That's something said by a lot of great libertarian activists. Larry Sharpe has made comments to that effect. And many other people who both have been in the military or have never been in the military have said, if they're in the military, get out. It's not going to help us. That's the spearhead of the libertarian movement. Now I want to show you, this is an image from House of Cards. I want to show you where the rest of the world is. This is where the libertarian movement is. Here's where the rest of the world is. And we see that this takes place from a debate in the show. And here's what they're debating on. Both of the candidates are attacking each other for sending their kids to private schools. This wasn't made 5,000 years ago. This is relatively recent. Both candidates are saying that paying for your own kid's education, being responsible, choosing to not be a part of a welfare state is not only wrong, but it's wrong to the point of being a massive political liability. To actually pay for your own kid's education is seen as morally reprehensible and politically disastrous. That is today's culture. That's the culture we live in right now. I'm gonna pause the sharing for a moment here. So when I talk about changing culture, we're going to have to deal with a lot of complex things. The first one is internal discord. In 2016, Matt Kuehnel, who was part of the Libertarian Socialist Caucus, went on stage running for chair, and he declared that he wanted Medicare for all. And he was booed. At the same time, I have routinely said, get rid of government schools, and also been booed in the same movement, in the same libertarian movement. There is no logical difference between Medicare for all and government schools for all. There's no economic difference. They cost about the same. There is only a cultural difference. And that cultural difference is what we're wrestling with right now. And today, for the first time, certainly in my lifetime, we have, well, an unpleasant situation, but one that gives us the opportunity to start trying to change some of this information, some of this culture. If our culture continues the worship of government schools, not only will government schools never go anywhere, but they will be seen as the de facto way to do education. It will be praised, it will be worshiped. Politicians will send their kids to government schools for political gain, not as a political liability. For us to change culture to that level, we're going to have to look at this in an objective way, without blinders on, without any kind of sugarcoating. So the first thing that I'm going to do as part of that is I am going to share with you guys. Let me share this thing over here real quick. I'm going to share with you guys a nonsensical statistic. This is an article in Fee. It's one of my favorite websites. And it says that homeschoolers, let me just get rid of that. It says that homeschoolers are creaming other students on the SAT. And you look at information like this and you think to yourself, well, if all that is happening, then everyone should homeschool. It's just self-interest at that point. It's not a moral question. It's not a political question. It's just a question of self-interest. The statistics over here, and remember, I'm giving you this as probably the biggest proponent of homeschooling, the biggest opponent of government schooling and the culture that they create. And I'm telling you right now that this information is total and utter nonsense. The only reason that the average homeschooler SAT score is higher than the average public school or private school SAT score is that most homeschoolers, 90+% of homeschoolers, don't take the SAT at all. Of the 1 or 2% of homeschoolers that take the SAT, yes, in that tiny little group, the average score is much higher. So in order for us to change culture, we are going to have to be a little bit more forthright with ourselves. We can't look at this stuff through rose-colored glasses, because if homeschool was actually right now, at this moment in time, as much better than public school as we all say it is, then everyone would already be doing it. If it really was in its current iteration that much better, everyone would already be doing it. I work with students from the most competitive schools in the world, from the most competitive magnet schools, places like Stuyvesant and TJ, the most competitive boarding schools, La Rosie, Exeter, Andover, most competitive private day schools, places like St. Albans, and to people who do homeschooling. And it is true that the most effective method academically is homeschooling when it's done right. And the simple fact is, it is almost never done right. For us to understand why it's being done wrong, for us to understand how we can change the culture, not just of politics, but of education as well, we're going to have to go to the history of why public schools came into existence in the first place. It wasn't simply a way to provide universal education. One of the biggest motives at the time, if you look in the history, you can see this, one of the biggest motivations at the time was to end child labor. And the idea, and whether that was for selfish economic reasons or altruistic humanitarian reasons, doesn't change the fact that the goal was to end child labor. The way to achieve that was to monopolize a student's time or a child's time somewhere else. So if you keep them in a school all day long and then have them do homework all night long, then they're not going to be doing any child labor. They just won't have the time. They won't be able to do it in a very physical and real sense. That type of education has colored the last century of education. That type of schooling has colored the perception of the last century of education. Bill Gates famously said, I'm going to paraphrase here, Bill Gates famously said that judging the stage of software development by the number of lines of code would be like judging airplane building by weight. A big, long, inefficient computer program is not better than a short, more elegant, more streamlined computer program. And a big, heavy plane might just fall out of the sky. Today, the reason that homeschooling sometimes succeeds so incredibly, I mean, we work with homeschoolers that are 5 or 6 years ahead of people in magnet schools, in elite boarding schools, in private schools. Why it succeeds so spectacularly some of the time, but fails so spectacularly the rest of the time, comes down to the way that we look at education. Public schools were created to monopolize a student's time. That means they're supposed to be inefficient. Private schools are mandated to waste time. They have to meet a certain length of time of day, number of days a week. So they have to spend 7 or 8 hours a day, even if the actual time you need for education is maybe 2 or 3 hours a day. And that's the culture of American education. Now, I've said that if we want to change government, we need to change culture. But if we want to change education, we need to change educational culture. And changing education, that's the linchpin right there. Here's why homeschooling and remote education really matter to the liberty movement in particular. Libertarian experts will always tell you that there are two ways that you can influence a decision. One is voice and one is exit. So for example, when you're eating at a restaurant, you don't have a say in what's on the menu. You don't get a vote. You don't have any ability to pick one drop of anything on the menu. But you have a different power. So you have no voice, but you have the power of exit, which means you can just leave and go to a different restaurant. If everyone in an area or a lot of people in an area want Thai food and none of the restaurants offer it, somebody else will create something. The power of exit, the power to say, I'll take my business elsewhere, is the driving force behind all the choices we have in the free market. If you can leave, if you can easily leave and go somewhere else, you have competition from the provider. The other way, of course, you can influence the decision-making is through voice. You can vote, you can do all that kind of stuff. If it's a company, you could be on the board of directors, you could be a CEO, and then you'd have a voice. But for most of us, most of the time in our day-to-day lives, and especially in relating to the free market, we don't really have a voice, and we don't really need a voice. Yeah, sure, sometimes we fill in surveys or whatever, but we don't really need a voice to do any of the things that we actually want to do. Because we have the power of exit, the providers find a way to figure out what we want before we've even expressed it to ourselves. They cater to our needs before we state them. They create needs for us to want. That's the power of exit. And the reason that homeschooling and remote schooling and all these things are so important to the liberty movement is it is one of the things that can give normal, average, middle-class Americans the power of exit. Which means this. Imagine this for a moment. Imagine if 100% of the country was homeschooling and teleworking. And suppose you're living in California and then they pass some tax that you just don't like. It's a 1% tax on orange juice. You really like orange juice. You just don't feel like dealing with it. You can leave and go to Nevada without having to get a new job, without disrupting your child's education one bit. If the entire United States does something similar, they put a 0.5% tax on something that you don't want to deal with, you can move to Mexico, the way my fellow candidate Dan Berman has already done. You can move to you can move to Europe, you can move to Africa, you can move to any different continent you like, any different country, any micronation or macronation that you like. The reason that homeschooling is both so important for the future of American education and the future of the liberty movement, and the reason that telework is also important to both the future of work and the future of the liberty movement, is that they bring the power of exit back to the American people. I want to show you how powerful that is, how powerful competition between countries can be. Not very long after the Brexit vote, Brexit hadn't even happened. Brexit didn't even really happen until a short time ago. Shortly after the Brexit vote, when now Britain and the mainland, the continent of Europe, were no longer forming this sort of unofficial economic cartel, two amazing things happened right away. The first was Britain got rid of a bunch of its regulatory departments, reduced some of its taxes and fees. More interestingly, so did France. The poster child of European socialism made it easier to fire people, got rid of unnecessary regulations on business the second that they had a competitor. The presence of a competitor gets people in line. If you're a gas station with terrible service and you see a new gas station just being built across the street, no one's left your business yet. Nothing has changed in a material way. You see that new gas station being built, you're going to get yourself in shape. You're going to improve quality, you're going to improve service, you're going to lower prices, you do whatever you need to do to deal with this competitor that does not even exist yet. If you're running a restaurant, the same. And if you're running a country, the absolute same thing happens. Here's how we know that the US government, at the very least, is afraid of this. The US government over the last years has been increasing the fees to leave, the exit fees. If you want to get rid of your US citizenship, it used to be a couple $100. Now it's $4,000. Might be even higher by now. I don't know. It's been gradually increasing because they've realized how big a threat this is. If people have the power of exit, then countries have to lower their taxes to the lowest possible level. If people have the power of exit, they have to get rid of nonsensical regulations. If people have the power of exit, they have to get rid of laws that imprison people for no good reason. If there's competition, or even just the threat of competition, like that unbuilt gas station scaring the actually existing gas station into shape, the threat of competition is enough to make libertarianism happen. We don't actually need one bit of voice to change American policy. We do need, if we do have the power of exit, American policy will change faster than we can possibly imagine. Just as that gas station that's being threatened by another gas station. So how can we bring that power of exit? How can we make this homeschooling dream, where this idea that homeschooling is always better, how can we make that a reality? Because the fact is, sometimes homeschooling is better. Sometimes it is so much better. I'll say this, the most advanced students that I've worked with, the ones that are 5-6 years ahead, the ones who are just demolishing the SAT, the most advanced students I've worked with have been homeschoolers. The second most advanced students I've worked with have been either going to schools like Exeter, Andover, or magnet schools like TJ or Stuyvesant. The top group has been homeschoolers. So I want to talk about what was it that made those homeschoolers different from the homeschoolers who are less academically successful. I talked earlier, a few minutes ago, about the fact that education began with one principle, which is we need to keep kids away from working. We need to end child labor, which means we need to waste time. And because of that, today education is generally measured in hours. It's written into law as hours. If you're starting a private school, they're going to tell you how many hours a day and how many days a week you count as a school year. They're measuring input, not output. Now, most of us who either work at or run businesses know that's an idiotic way to measure something. You want success is defined by success, by results, by the achievements, not by how much you put into it. If you pay $5 million for something, it's not better to do that than to pay $10 to get the exact same thing. One of the big criticisms that we've had, of course, of government spending is that they often pay way more than they need to get the same thing. Paying champagne prices for beer, to quote the great libertarian communicator Michael Cloud. The homeschoolers that have succeeded the most have been the ones who have rejected that position, who have stopped measuring their education by input. They've started measuring their education purely, entirely by results. So what do results mean? They can mean a lot of things. They can mean, mastery of robotics or chess. They can mean, winning a competition. They can mean lots of things. But for most people who are in middle and high school and are going in that kind of college prep route where they want to make sure that they can get into a top college if they want to go to college, or if they don't want to do that, have some way to prove to employers that they really have this strong academic backing. The way to do that is to measure things, generally speaking, through standardized universal tests. Since I know a lot of people who are homeschooling right now will be watching it, and I know that standardized tests are generally hated and by lots of parts of the homeschool community, I do want to take a moment to set the record straight on a few things. The first, the SAT is not run by the government. It is a private company that has a competitor, the ACT. It has a few other smaller competitors. It does get crony capitalism. It gets subsidies. I'm not going to deny that for a second. But you know what? So does McDonald's. McDonald's also gets subsidies. So does Chick-fil-A. I mean, every big company that I've ever heard of has managed to finagle some kind of subsidies. But getting subsidies does not mean you are run by the government. We don't think of Chick-fil-A as being a government agency. And in the same way, the SAT and the SAT subject test and the AP exams, these are not run by the government. Remember, I hate government as much as anybody. These things are simply not run by the government. So when we're trying to build a homeschooling environment that creates liberty, because not all homeschooling creates liberty, we need to make sure that we're measuring by success, measuring by the actual achievements, measuring by what goals did you set and what goals did you achieve? So I'm going to take a moment to just walk through a simple example. And this is an important example for me because it was my first example of doing this. I wasn't homeschooled, but I did a lot of my education outside of school. Those of you guys who've been to my education website saw that in high school I took 10 different I got 5s on 10 different APs, but for 6 of them, I never took an AP course. Many of my students have gotten many more APs than that. And 5, by the way, is the highest possible score. And we'll talk about that a little bit. But the very first time I did this, I had this experience. I was taking a biology class in high school. The teacher told us 2 things. 1, you should take the SAT subject test in biology. And 2, that the class wasn't going to prepare us for it. I thought that was idiotic. So spring break was coming up. I got something called the Barron's SAT subject test book. I studied that for biology. I studied it hardcore for a week. And in a week, I learned more than I had in the previous several months of the school class. Then I took another week off of school. And in those 2 weeks, that was enough to get a top 1% score. Now, you don't need to get a top 1% score. If you can get a top 51% score, you already have convinced yourself that you don't need to be in school anymore. If you can, the school average is the 50th percentile. If you can get the 51st percentile, that's enough that you can convince yourself. What made that important, what made that moment so influential for me is that I realized I'd accomplished more in 2 weeks on my own than in 8 months with somebody else wasting my time. And in that time, I started to really think about what was happening in education. I looked back and I realized so many of the assignments and projects, making models out of paper mache or Jello or whatever, they weren't efficient. They weren't designed to be efficient. They were designed to waste time. I compared the school's textbook with the study guide that I'd gotten and realized that the school's textbook was intentionally worded in a way to be ambiguous and difficult, just annoying 5,000 pages where 50 would have sufficed. Now today, because I understand politics a bit more, I understand where those textbooks come from. The textbooks we see in school are not the ones that anyone would buy for themselves. If you're considering homeschooling, by the way, don't buy the same textbooks that are used in your school. Those textbooks aren't the best books. They're the books produced by the companies with the best lobbyists. So in that moment, in that time, the realization that I had, and have now shared with hundreds, thousands at this point of students, is that education is not measured by how much time it wastes. It's not measured by how much effort you put into it. It's measured only by how much you learn. The reason that I encourage using standardized tests, and I know this can be unpopular in the homeschooling community, is that it's a way to prove it to the outside world. You can say all day long that you know a thing, but having some sort of measurable proof, some sort of a universal indication, carries a lot of weight. So I want to paint this picture. Imagine for a moment that you have homeschoolers that were using this kind of aggressive, intensive college prep homeschooling, or people right now just opting out of this and doing this kind of homeschooling. Then the results, the actual results, would be in line with the pretend results that we're seeing. Homeschoolers would universally be academically measurably ahead of their public school peers and their private school peers and their boarding school peers. Let's talk a little bit about the specific ways that we do that, both at Vohra Method and with people I speak to informally. The ways that we do that really come down to making sure that you're following the following principles. The first is, if you're learning something, have some way to prove it. If it's computer programming, it can be a GitHub account. It doesn't have to be an exam, but it has to be something where you can prove that you have this skill in computers, robotics, plumbing, whatever you want. The second thing, Make sure you have some sort of, if it's a test, make sure you have some kind of a clear study guide for SAT subject tests and AP tests. That's going to be the Barron's books for those tests. There's a lot of competitors out there, stuff like Princeton Review. Those books are just too easy. They give you a false sense of security. Get the Barron's ones. Those ones actually work. 3, you need lectures. Now, I know that a lot of people say you don't need any lectures. Kids need lectures. And here's why. Through a lecture, through that voice, you get that subconscious sense of what's really important in a subject, what's kind of important, and what really doesn't matter that much. Kids can hear this intuitively. Think of an infant for a moment. An infant falls down and doesn't know whether or not he's hurt himself. He looks to his mom or dad or other caretaker for their reaction before he decides whether or not to start crying. That emotional reaction that affects infants also affects middle schoolers, also affects high schoolers. They can hear in the voice of the presenter whether or not something is vitally important to the subject or not. And except for the very, very, very best readers in the entire world, that's not going to happen just from books. The lecture series that we recommend, there's 2. The first is Crash Course. Crash Course was put together by the same person who wrote that depressing book, Fault in Our Stars. Great author, but also a great educator. The second, you all know Khan Academy. And using a combination of those 2 will give you more than enough lecture for almost any subject under the sun. Then the other piece is, what type of textbook should you use? And I do believe that textbooks are valuable. As much of an educational renegade as I am, I am not, for most people, I don't usually see unschooling as the most effective way for homeschooling. To me, a rigorous college prep approach to homeschooling that combines lectures, tests, and all that, yeah, you're doing kind of the same thing, but you're doing it at such a much more, a faster and more advanced level. When you're picking a textbook, here's the thing that you need to keep in mind. Find the easiest book on that subject that you can find. The books out there, those big giant Pearson's textbooks, they're not good. They're just long. And if it takes you 5,000 pages to write what could have been expressed in 30 pages, that doesn't mean you're super smart. It means you have a disorganized mind. So you want to make sure you're picking the easiest book on that subject. One of the series that we recommend strongly is the Big Fat Notebook series. They're 500 pages or so nominally, but each page has like 3 sentences on it. So they're really quick to get through. Most students can get through them very, very easily in a week or 2. When you put all these together, we now have a system. We have an elite homeschooling system that can be compared head to head with what's happening in elite private schools, in elite boarding schools, and magnet schools, and you can come out ahead. Because here's why. The one thing that every person in an elite boarding school, magnet school, and private school that I've ever worked with, what they all have in common, they have no free time. So they can't do these extra things. So you can get pretty far ahead of them. I want to use one case example to show the ways in which homeschooling can absolutely, measurably dominate public or private or magnet or boarding school systems. And I want to use something called the AP history exam. AP exams are college level exams. Every time you pass one, that gives you get college credit for that course, depending on the college. If you take 4 of them, that basically pays for a semester of college. That means you get, it's, that's maybe tens of thousands of dollars right there. You take 8, that could be an entire year, even more money that you're saving. Take 12, that's a year and a half. So you can really save a pretty substantial amount of money, even if you're planning to go to college. If you're not planning to go to college, then you're just showing employers that you have these abilities. One of the interesting things that we discovered at Vohra Method was that the skills that we were teaching for the AP US History exam, the AP European History exam, the AP World History exam, it's all the same skills. And so what we did is we came up with a single training method to prepare you for 3 exams per year rather than the 1 per year that schools do. So our students that go through that program can take 6 of the AP history exams, which is basically unheard of for anyone stuck in a private or public or boarding or magnet school. That will never, ever happen in a private school or a public school. they will, even though they all theoretically, we do a lot of consultation with schools and other companies and whatnot. We could teach them how to do it, or they could figure it out on their own. They're never going to do it, because the other tradition of education that has been going on in the United States of America since the beginning is that education is supposed to be indoctrination. One of the other justifications for universal public education, in addition to the child labor thing, was to make sure that everybody had the same culture. Because we had all these people, these Irish people and Polish people and German people, and we needed to teach them what it meant to be American. And so while indoctrination exists in many, many school subjects, it exists in the history classes most of all. There is not a public or private school in the planet that I've ever heard of where a single one of the teachers would be willing to give up a year's worth of indoctrination, or if we're talking about 6 exams, 6 years or 6 full year course worth of indoctrination to give their students that academic advantage instead. It's never going to happen. And so if you're homeschooling and you say indoctrination is not part of my schooling, busy work is not part of my schooling, all this other kind of nonsense is not part of what I'm doing, now you're in this incredible position where you can get miles and miles ahead. And so let's put all of that stuff together. Right now, there is one thing blocking libertarian culture. It's not 2 things, it's not 10 things. It's the one thing. It is our universal worship of government schools. Even inside the liberty movement, a public school teacher is seen as a really great person. Somebody who uses public schools is seen as a very responsible parent. Generally, even in the libertarian movement, somebody who's using a public school is often seen as more responsible than somebody who's using a private school. Education, academically, doesn't make any sense. Morally, I don't see how that fits within libertarian morality, but that is our culture, right? That's the culture we're living in. So if we culturally knock down public schools, if we knock down all government schools right today, this culture is going to recreate them because they are lionized. So we have to appeal to a few things. We can try logic inside the liberty movement. And I think in certain groups, it can land. I've had many people have come up to me that said, like, that me talking about public schools as a type of welfare, as part of the welfare state, opened their eyes to a thing that they just hadn't thought about. And so that will work, and I don't think we should stop doing that. But what's really going to make the big difference here is once the free market, and I mean free in both sense, 1, uncontrolled by regulation, and 2, you don't have to pay any money to use it. Once the totally free market is able to provide a superior alternative, once putting your kids in public school means that they're going to be doing like half or a third as many AP exams, they're going to be getting lower scores, they're going to be more stressed out and anxious because the schools are wasting so much time and kids are doing hours and hours of homework a night for no reason. Once we could really make these pretend statistics true statistics, once we can really show that this works better, we're going to change American culture. Education is the linchpin to this movement. Education turned into homeschooling gives us voice. Gives us the power of exit. Education in the form of homeschooling gives us the ability to develop self-motivation, to show that we don't need, neither children nor adults need somebody else to tell them what to do all the time, but rather that we can choose to be excellent on our own. If we can change American culture, if we can change this one piece of American culture just by doing one thing, which is making sure that homeschooling is better. And the way to do that, again, is to make sure your homeschooling is focused on the goals, not by how much time you can spend on it, by turning it into an actual measurable goal, not a daily chore. If we can do that, and we can, that will change American culture. And if we change this culture, we will absolutely change this government. I'd like to pause and first thank everybody for attending and see if you guys have any questions or comments or anything along those lines.
Fantastic, Arvin. Yes, there's definitely some hands up, I would say. That really was a great way to kind of label the realities of it too, and it kind of mirrors. You know, I was a big fan of Milton Friedman's, and, you know, at the end of his career, he was talking about, he figured out it was education. That was his, he spent all those years thinking he was in a good place, and he was, and made a lot of good information, educated a lot of people, but it wasn't moving the needle like what you're saying. And that's really what it requires. And again, as we've been preaching, what we're engaged on the health side, unless you personally take back control of healthcare, it's not going to get fixed. There's no government entity, nothing. Like you said, whoever's got the best lobbyist or whatever, that's who's going to prevail. For me, eons ago, I used to be in the record business, and so you needed permission to be famous forever, because you needed a patron saint in the old days if you were an artist. And then, you know, if I want to be the next big hit record, I needed the label and all the what that brought. But then suddenly YouTube showed up, and the power of exit entered that field, because then I could become Justin Bieber, and I didn't need to have an agent or whatever. I made myself famous because I got to stand on the strength of my talent for the first time on parity with everybody else who was spending millions to be my competitor. So that just goes to show what you're describing is the most important one. We need to follow that exact path. So I appreciate you making voice to this. Charles, I see your hands up.
Thank you, Jeff. And Arvin, that was fantastic. Extending that education freedom linchpin to today's crisis du jour, you said that getting freedom in education will lead people to demand freedom elsewhere. They won't want to be told what to do. Are folks doing what they're being told to do now in this pandemic crisis? Should they be? Do you think we'll lose the right to refuse or exit as the government clamps down on this crisis and inevitably with future crises? How do you see your education freedom idea affecting, you know, this year's series of crises and maybe preparing us for future crises?
So I see it as going in one of two directions. And we've seen in our own students, we've seen some of our students saying, well, if I'm going to be at home anyway, I might as well homeschool with something that makes some sense instead of, you know, following their idiot ideas. You know, a lot of people recognize that public school academics isn't very good, but, you know, their friends are there and they say, well, if I'm going to hang out with my friends, I have to go there too. But a lot have started to say, to realize that you're at home, you can either do the stupid busy work they're assigning through their e-learning, or you can leave, use a goal-oriented homeschooling and actually make that jump. So for that latter group, it's going to be a long-term change, I think, without any question. However, that culture runs very, very deep. So a lot of our students are in the other category where they say, oh, I guess my teacher's school assigned me this idiot busy work. I guess I should do that because that's, you know, what I was told to do. So that culture of obedience to an educational institution, it's a hard one. It's a hard one to break even in this circumstance. In terms of the larger question of, you know, will this help or hurt liberty in the long run? I think this is a time where we need to point out that when things matter, everyone is a libertarian. I've spoken for years, and I know you guys have talked about for years, the idea that preventing foreign doctors from practicing medicine in America is insane. It doesn't make any sense. I mean, why shouldn't the best doctor in Switzerland be allowed to practice over here? And now, because there's this sudden shortage, a lot of states have removed those restrictions, right? They're becoming more libertarian. Laws against, you know, home alcohol delivery are gone because, again, when things actually matter, people aren't going to stand by their just idiotic nonsense regulations that don't make any sense. They're going to say, okay, let's actually take this seriously now. So I think we're going to see a mix, but the key is we have to be ruled in this time by logic, not fear. Because yeah, this stuff is terrifying. I mean, the idea that, you know, any one of us could be at physical risk, or our parents or grandparents, it's terrifying. I mean, nobody likes that. But this is that time to use to do the best you can with this. If you're an entrepreneur or you have thought about being an entrepreneur, use this time to get ahead. The really big mistake that I believe the administration has made so far in this area, and the mistake that we've also made in listening to it, is they've lied about how long this is going to take. This is not going to take a month. It's going to take a year. And if we know it's going to take a year, we can prepare. If we're saying that it's going to be 3 weeks, we're like, yeah, 3 weeks, I'll just wait for it to blow over. So this is a time where adaptation and change really needs to be the driving force for all of us, both in the liberty movement and outside of it.
Nicely stated there. David, I see your hands up.
Arvin, how do we apply exit power to the government edicts right now and their mismanagement to work around it, circumvent it, civil disobedience, nullification, those type of things? Your thoughts on that?
So I think this is a time where we need to realize that even a broken clock can be occasionally right. So a few weeks ago, before any stay-at-home orders came out, a few weeks ago, I announced publicly that I was suspending all of my campaign travel. And, you know, this took a lot of people by surprise for a few reasons. One, I seem to be the least afraid of any massive social change of anybody. I'm also not in a high-risk group. As far as I know, I don't have any immune situations, and I'm not, and my age group is a relatively low-risk group. One of the things that has been very powerful for me being in the liberty movement is this idea that we actually have to take care of each other, right? It's not that like once the government is gone, then there's not going to be any hunger or disease ever again. It's that we have to take control of it. So I chose to suspend my campaign travel because I knew that if I was going from state to state to state to state the way I was going to be putting a lot of other people at risk, a lot of people who I respected highly, a lot of people who are huge influences on me. And so I didn't want to do that. So I chose to make a, you know, pretty significant sacrifice in terms of the campaign, you know, not traveling is going to hurt things very early on. So I made that decision voluntarily. Now Maryland has issued a stay-at-home order. I live in Maryland. Maryland has issued a stay-at-home order. And a big part of me wanted to say, screw it. If you were going to tell me to stay at home, I'm going to go out right this second. And there is certainly that emotional response. But I think here, first, we have to objectively realize that this is an actual danger. It's not it's not weapons of mass destruction. This is not the Gulf of Tonkin. This is not one of those government lies. This is something that I've had independently verified by multiple experts in medicine, epidemiology. I mean, this isn't pretend. So the first thing I would say is you can stay at home because you choose to, rather than because the government's ordering you to. And those of you guys who want to get a much more philosophical analysis of this, I recommend reading Albert Camus' The Myth of Sisyphus, which kind of talks about this far better than I ever could. But the other thing is there are things happening right now that we should be resisting. Today, one of the reasons that we have some of the problems that we do is because we don't have the kind of local cottage industries that have been a normal part of life for most of history. If I want to buy a dinner from my neighbor, that's illegal and that's idiotic, because the more localized things are, the less quickly epidemics can blow up the way this one has. So this is a time where I do believe we should be ignoring the laws against, you know, buying food in the cottage industry type ways, you know, growing or selling produce in those similar cottage industries. I think this is the time where we say, absolutely not. I will not put myself and others at risk to follow a stupid law. I was willing, and still am willing, to, you know, really, in a lot of ways, damage my campaign by suspending travel because I wanted to I didn't want to put other people at risk. For the same thing, we should be willing to break laws that put other people at risk. And laws that say you cannot buy things from your neighbor, they are literally putting people at risk because they're increasing the travel distance and thus allowing whatever disease vectors to travel greater distances. So the short answer is yes, I do believe this is a time for civil disobedience, but not for ill-considered civil disobedience. I do believe that this is a legitimate health threat and should be treated as such, but we shouldn't be following some of the nonsense decrees that are coming out there.
Very, very well put. Charles, I see you've got your hand again.
Sure. And to that extent that you promote local crafts and food, we did have last summer Joel Salatin on the craft food movement that is allowing farmers and family farms and local families to create some local product, food, eggs, whatever, raw milk, and sell it locally. That would kind of decrease the vectors, I think. Talk about that, back to your telecommuting point, where people need to adapt now, especially if you're right that this stay-at-home kind of advice is going to last a year. And quickly, what about those experts who think that while social distancing is necessary, there are experts that say there's no getting around herd immunity. You do need to mix internationally so that we can get used to these viruses and then the mutations. In other words, instead of distancing, mix, let the infections happen, and then become more immune naturally.
Sure.
Go ahead.
I'd certainly like to speak on both those points. I think they're very central to this general theme. The first is, it's important to realize that civil disobedience is part of libertarianism, but so is entrepreneurship. And this is the time to be working on new business models. I mean, right now you have a lot of businesses that are paying for expensive street level retail and basically operating as delivery only programs. There's no real reason for that. I mean, this is a time where if you've ever thought about creating a delivery only restaurant or other food service, do it now. This is the time to do it. I mean, that's what we need. If you have other ideas on how to improve things, do this now. Teleworking, and for those of you who are watching who are business owners or entrepreneurs, listen, teleworking, there is investment in it. I don't just mean like paying for Zoom or Slack. That there's free versions and there's relatively inexpensive versions. I'm talking about training your team and yourself to be able to effectively telework. It took my business about 2 years to do it. It was a big and massive investment. The reason that we did that investment, one of the many reasons, by the way, was that we wanted to give more people the opportunity to exit. We wanted people to be able to come to our services and then move to Australia and keep on using our services with no interruption to education. So this is the time where you want to encourage those types of entrepreneurial endeavors. And if you've ever thought about it, do it now. Don't wait, because this is not a 1 month thing. There's a lot of experts who have said that the only way we're going to get to this is to protect this is herd immunity. And there are ways to do that. I mean, they're barbaric, but there are ways to do it. I mean, you could take everyone who's in a low risk category, kind of intentionally infect them the way we used to with chickenpox with kids. And that would create like buffers for the people who are in older categories. I don't support doing that. I mean, that to me is a level of barbarism that I'm just not at all okay with. We could get a total herd immunity very quickly. And honestly, if it wasn't for the AMA having kind of screwed us over on this, we could have do it right now. The reason we can't just have, we can't just like let this run wild and deal with it quickly is we are at a risk for the number of critical cases to exceed the number of hospital beds and doctors. Now we can make new beds, we can crank out new ventilators, we can mass produce both the equipment and medicine that we need. We can't get new doctors that quickly. And the reason we don't have as many doctors as we should have is, one, the AMA has worked to keep foreign doctors from practicing. And two, the AMA has worked to restrict the number of medical residencies available. So in America, we produce far fewer doctors than we need to. And today we are, paying the price for that. So there are alternative ways to get the herd immunity other than large scale vaccination, which I believe should only be done voluntarily. But the current cost of doing that in lives would be, in my view, so disproportionate that it just wouldn't be worth it.
Very good. Charles, I'm sorry, David, I see you got your hand again. Got time for this one last question, David.
Okay. Arvin, we know that interactive learning increases retention rate. Mm-hmm. What are your thoughts on emphasizing or de-emphasizing interactive learning in your Vohra method in terms of using games that teach and particularly teleeducation?
Sure. I'm a big supporter of active learning. And what I mean by active learning is something that's not a lecture. So that means I'm a huge fan of classwork. Inside all Vohra method students have access to, and by the way, if any of you are watching and you're not a Vohra method student, you just want free access, we've also set things up so that anyone in the public can get that free access to our vocabulary training programs that are much more gamified, that are, there's like, high scores and competitions and all that kind of stuff. So it's very true that if kids are engaged and excited and all that, they're feeling competitive or active or having a conversation, they're going to learn more. And I think that is one of the downsides of public and private schools. If you have a lot of people to educate, you're going to default to lecture. I mean, it's the only way to do it with that large a group of people. But if you're able to be more innovative, more personalized, you can do a lot better than that. And so yes, absolutely, you should engage active learning, gamification, all that. And the way to do that is to choose to do it for yourself, to make sure you're looking for different options and never let this be a passive process. Public school education is like done to you, but real education you have to earn for yourself.
What about teleeducation?
Same thing. I mean, our when we do our Vohra method classes, they're super interactive. I mean, you do one question at a time. You know, we check your work, we discuss the question, and that's happening in our group classes. Obviously, tutoring is even more engaging than that. Khan Academy, they have, you know, questions and that come at the end of their learning sessions. You have places like Chess Academy where it's so interactive, but not monitors. It's massively scalable. There's not a human interacting with you, but there's videos and explanations, and it's so great. And you see that even when learning something as kind of tricky as high level chess, you can create systems that make it engaging, make it interactive, and still totally free.
Thank
What
you.
a great way to demonstrate the market there, Arvin. Fantastic. Another super guest today. I appreciate you being here, and we'll definitely want to stay in touch.
Absolutely. Thank you guys for having me on.
Okay, I stopped the recording here at this point.